By the end of this video, I want to persuade you that it's just as rational to believe the claim that the sun will not rise tomorrow as it is to believe the claim that the sun will rise tomorrow. I want to persuade you that it's just as rational to believe that a tomato will rise instead of the sun rising tomorrow. So let's get started on the problem of induction. So we are about to explore one of the most interesting, frustrating, and misunderstood problems in philosophy, the problem of induction. If Hume is correct about the problem of induction, then there is much that we think we know, but we just don't know. So the first thing to understand about the problem of induction is the difference between inductive and deductive arguments. So here's an example of an inductive argument. Swan 1 is white, swan 2 is white, swan 3 is white, swan 1000 is white, so all swans are white. So you'll notice that in a strong inductive argument, the premises provide probabilistic support for the conclusion. But it's possible that not all swans are white, even though those 1000 swans are white. Now, in a deductive argument, it's a little bit different. In a valid deductive argument, the conclusion must follow if the premises are true. So if I say all swans are white, I am a swan, then it must follow that I am white. So that's the difference between deductive and inductive. Now here's the thing. Many forms of common sense, knowledge claims about the future, and science depend upon induction. So if there's a problem with induction, then there's a problem with science, common sense, and knowledge claims about the future. They're not really knowledge. So let's ease into this problem with the turkey story by that jokester Bertrand Russell. So a turkey notices that the farmer has fed him every day at 9 a.m., and this has occurred every day of the turkey's life. Now the turkey uses inductive reasoning to conclude that this feeding will continue every day, and he's a happy little turkey, or happy fat turkey. However, it's Thanksgiving Day and the farmer slaughters him instead of feeding him. So this presents one problem with induction. It presents a problem with assuming the future will be like the past. Now, you could argue that the turkey should have used better induction. So the turkey needed more observations, a larger sample size about what happened to other turkeys on past holidays. And if he had a larger sample size, he could have used induction to know that he was going to be slaughtered. And so some people argue that we just need more and better induction to solve any problems with induction, or at least this problem of induction. But the problem of induction is not so easily solved. It cannot be solved by more or better induction, for the problem is whether we are rationally justified in believing the future will continue to be like the past. So to better understand why the problem of induction is still a serious problem, consider the following dialogue between David Hume and Bob. So David Hume starts off and he says, "Hi Bob, did you know that your expectation that the sun will rise tomorrow is completely irrational? It's just as reasonable to believe the sun will not rise tomorrow. In fact, it's just as reasonable to believe a tomato will rise instead." Now Bob objects and he says, "Don't be ridiculous, Mr. Hume. What are you smoking? The sun has risen for millions of years, so it's reasonable for me to believe that it will rise tomorrow. Now there's a chance that a comet will destroy the earth tomorrow, but that's improbable. The sun will probably rise tomorrow, and I'm rationally justified in believing and expecting that. And it's not as likely that a tomato will rise tomorrow. Be rational, Mr. Hume." So David Hume responds. He says, "Well, Bob, I see your argument depends on induction, because you think you are justified in believing the sun will probably rise tomorrow because it has risen for a long time. Your argument is not based on deduction because, as you acknowledge, there's a possibility that the sun will not rise tomorrow. So you must justify induction to justify your belief about the sun rising. But the problem with induction is it makes the unwarranted assumption that the future will be like the past. In other words, it makes the assumption that nature is uniform." Now Bob is thinking a little more deeply, and Bob responds, "Well, I don't understand. I know that I cannot use deduction to prove the sun will rise tomorrow, but surely I'm more justified in believing the sun will rise tomorrow than the alternative that it won't, or that a tomato will rise instead. It's just ridiculous." So induction is reasonable because rejecting induction leads to absurd beliefs about the future, like a tomato's rising. So Hume responds here. He says, "Let me clarify. Your belief that the sun will rise instead of a tomato is based on a feeling, not a good reason. So my position is it feels absurd to say a tomato will rise tomorrow, but it is no more irrational than saying the sun will rise tomorrow. It feels absurd, but it's not logically absurd." So here is the central problem, the key. Induction depends on an unjustified assumption. Whenever you use induction to reason about the future, you assume that nature is uniform. Now, assuming nature is uniform is the unjustified assumption upon which induction depends. And by uniform, I mean the patterns that we have observed locally are likely to carry on into those portions of the universe that we have not yet observed. And that includes the future and the past. So you expect the sun will rise and that gravity will be the same and billiard balls will move when struck and so on, because you assume the universe is patterned in the same way it has been in your previous experience. So I can also phrase the problem like this. If you did not believe the universe was patterned the same way as in the past, present and future, then you would not expect the sun to continue to rise. So the bottom line is you must assume that nature is uniform when using induction. And that assumption is unwarranted, rationally speaking, unwarranted. Okay, so Bob is thinking about that and he says, okay, Mr. Hume, I understand your point that induction presupposes the uniformity of nature. But why shouldn't I believe the universe is uniform, that the future will be like the past? Isn't that just self-evident? Now, Hume's response takes the argument deeper and gives us a helpful metaphor. So here's Hume's response. I think not. Induction presupposes the universe follows the same patterns at all times and places. And this is unwarranted since you have not observed all times and places. You have only observed your little patch of the universe. So even scientists with their telescopes have only observed a small part of the universe. So a metaphor can help here. Imagine this colored quilt is like the universe, and we humans are tiny bugs who have always experienced this little blue region of the universe, the quilt. We have only seen and experienced this blue part of the quilt, and then we use induction to believe the entire universe is blue, or like this blue part. So we assume that the laws that govern this patch govern the entire universe. But why assume this? If the universe is like the quilt, we are mistaken. So in our patch, the sun rises every day, billiard balls seem to obey the same natural laws, and measurements of gravity are constant. But these are only local regularities if the universe has many patches like this quilt. In the next patch, suns may randomly rise. Gravity may have different constants if it exists at all, and billiard balls may disappear when struck by other balls. In short, the belief that nature is uniform is unjustified. Okay, now Bob is really thinking instead of drinking, and he says, here's Bob's response. Yes, thank you, Mr. Hume, for that helpful metaphor and analysis. The universe could be irregular, and it would be wrong of me to assume the whole universe is like my little patch of it. I don't want to mistake local regularities for universal regularities. But I still feel like I'm justified in believing the universe is uniform and that the sun will most likely rise tomorrow. I still feel it so strongly. Now, Hume is sympathetic to this response. He says, I understand the way you feel. I feel your pain. My point is that it's just a feeling. It's a feeling of anticipation or expectation, but it has no rational justification. To justify it, you have to use induction. But you cannot justify induction because you cannot justify the claim that nature is uniform. So the reason you feel the sun will rise tomorrow, which I acknowledge is a strong feeling within you and me, the reason you feel it will rise tomorrow is a psychological fact about humans. It's not a belief that is rationally warranted. But now, suddenly, Bob has an objection. Something grasps his mind. He says, hold your horses, Mr. Hume. Don't you have the burden of proof to give evidence for the patchwork quilt theory instead of putting the burden of proof on me to prove the universe is uniform? Your idea seems crazy, so don't you have the burden of proof to prove it? But David Hume quickly responds, no, the burden of proof is on you, for you are assuming the universe is uniform when you say it's reasonable to believe the sun will rise tomorrow and that scientific laws will continue as they have in the past. When you assume the universe is uniform, you are making a broad claim about the entire universe, about all times and places. But I am not. Since you are making such a broad and positive claim about all times and places, I believe the burden of proof is on you. Now, Bob, like most of us, is resisting this absurd conclusion that the tomato is just as likely to rise tomorrow as the sun. And so he responds. He says, okay, I hadn't thought about it like that. Induction does presuppose that nature is uniform, which is an assumption about all times and places. So the burden does seem to be on me. Here's Bob's next attempt. So he says, let me try to justify induction like this. Nature is uniform because it is uniform around here at this time. My recent pasts have been like my past past, and so I'm justified in believing my future futures will be like my past futures. So for example, on Tuesday I expected the sun to rise on Wednesday, and it did. So that pattern kept repeating, so I'm justified in believing it will continue to do so. So here's how Hume responds. Well, Bob, it now sounds like you're smoking something funny. Past and recent futures? You're tying yourself in knots. Here's the problem. Notice your argument is circular because you are using induction to try to justify induction. You are using the uniformity of nature in your little patch of the universe to argue that all patches are uniform. When you are inferring your future futures will be like your past past because they have always been like your past past, you are using induction to try to justify induction. That is, you are begging the question. So let's summarize. Induction depends on the idea that nature is uniform, so you must justify this assumption to justify induction. But the assumption that nature is uniform can only be confirmed by observing that nature is uniform around here, and then concluding that this is what it must be like overall. But such a justification would itself be inductive. So our justification begs the question, or is circular, because we're trying to use induction to justify induction. Now, at this point, Bob's a little frustrated, like most of us who encounter this problem. And he says, I think we need some common sense here, Hume. Look, science works well, so we should trust it. And we should trust the inductive process underlying science. Induction has led to computers, nuclear weapons, and toasters. Induction produces true beliefs because it works so well in the real world. The fact that induction has worked so well justifies induction. And that's my argument for induction. I don't have time for this sort of stupid skeptical philosophy. I need to go make some toasters. Now, of course, Hume has a good response to this very common objection. Hume says, I understand your frustration, but it may make you feel better to know that I trust and use induction too, even though I don't believe it can be rationally justified. The difference is I know induction is not rationally justified, whereas you think it is. Outside of my study, I rely on common sense and science and induction, but my point is that common sense, science, and induction are not rational. So the same problem arises here when you mention nuclear weapons and toasters and so on. And the problem is this. You're using induction to try to justify induction. When you argue that induction has worked well until now to produce toasters and nuclear weapons, so it will continue to work in the future, you are trying to use induction to justify induction. This is circular. It's like saying, I can trust Bob because Sally says he is trustworthy. And I can trust Sally because Bob said she is trustworthy. You just go in circles. So your argument begs the question. You cannot use induction to justify induction. Sorry, Bob. So Bob replies, well, that's quite a skeptical conclusion, but do you really believe it's just as likely that the sun will not rise or that a tomato will rise instead? And Hume responds in the following way. He says, I confess that I do not really believe that, but it's just a psychological fact about myself and other humans. My point is I can't help but believe that it's more likely the sun will rise tomorrow. I feel it's more reasonable to believe the sun will rise tomorrow, but I know there are no rational grounds for believing it. I cannot stop believing that the sun will most likely rise tomorrow instead of a tomato, and that the future will be like the past, even though I know it's irrational to do so. So let's go on believing the sun will rise, but not make the mistake of believing it is rational to do so. So that ends the dialogue between David Hume and Bob. They go on to enjoy a fine meal and discuss politics and history and so on. So let's wrap this up. The problem of induction is upsetting to many people because philosophy is again showing people they don't know what they think they know. The problem of induction shows we have no knowledge of the unobserved. The startling conclusion is not simply that we cannot be certain of what will happen in the future. It is we are no more rational in believing the sun will rise in the future than that it won't. Now, most people misunderstand this argument, so let me make it clear. I am just as rationally justified in believing a tomato will rise as you are in believing the sun will. Everything we observe so far gives us no clue as to what will happen in the future. Induction cannot be rationally justified, and all attempts to justify it are circular. Now, there is still no consensus among philosophers on how to solve this problem, so Hume might be correct. I added a few other comments on the screen here, but what do you think? Can you solve the problem of induction, or do you just dismiss it because you have more important things to do, like making toasters and nuclear weapons? Thanks.